All right, guys. I know we got a minute or two to go, and I'm going to keep admitting if people come in. Um, it's a balmy 47 degrees here in Baltimore. Um,
It's 35 degrees in Northfield, Vermont, where I am, and we had snow this morning, so it's pretty balmy up here as well. Our
okay.
third year so far in Vermont.
Other guest topics to touch on real quick before we let our speaker do his thing. One is, for those of you who don't know, the tentatively the annual meeting for the Baltimore chapter at the Peabody Heights Brewery will be February 6th, which is a Sunday. The next edition of the Baltimore Chop should be out within a week, so be on the lookout for that. Those of you in the Baltimore area, the 13th is the launch in person of the SABR book, the Baltimore baseball book that is coming out. So hopefully anybody who's local can come to that at the Babe Ruth Museum. And trying to think, anything else? Our next meeting obviously will be two more with speakers for this calendar year. We have Mass and broadcaster, whose name has escaped me right now. Next,
Jeff Arnold.
Jeff Arnold, formerly of Frederick Keys, who will talk to us 2 weeks from today during our called shot lunchtime meeting. And then the first Wednesday in December, we have Adrian Roberson, who is the Orioles public address announcer, and has been was with Bay Sox for 17 or 18 seasons before that. So without further ado, obviously good lead in is we know who won last night. First title since '95. Personally, I was pulling for Atlanta in honor of Hank Aaron. I'm sorry, Dusty Baker, but you have to take a back seat once again. So we'll let Clayton, I think you're the president up there in Vermont.
Yeah, I'm the president of the Vermont chapter. I was in the Boston chapter for many years. When I got a teaching job in Vermont, there really wasn't an active chapter at the time. So the guy who had previously been there said, "Get it going." So I have over the last 3 years or so.
So excellent. We appreciate that. And hopefully you'll be coming to Baltimore next summer with the rest.
I'm planning to. Yeah, I'm planning to see all you guys in person.
Excellent. So I will let you take it away, talk about your book. And I'm going to go on mute. Everybody else go on mute. And we'll pepper Mr. Trutor with some questions afterwards.
Peter, thanks for having me. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Although I heard you guys are having Thomas Wolfe from The Called Shot. That's a fantastic book. He spoke at our chapter too. That was a great talk. I read the book too. It's fantastic. And I think you guys are all going to enjoy it. And it's a fellow University of Nebraska press publication.
Actually had him already. So
oh, you did? Oh, fantastic. Yeah, he was great.
Yeah, I have the book on the shelf too.
Great. My name is Clayton Trutor. I'm a professor at Norwich University, which is a small military college in Vermont. I'm the chairman of the Vermont SABR chapter, and I'm a historian. My training is in modern U.S. urban and cultural history. I got trained at Boston College, and I have recently written a book which will be published by the University of Nebraska Press in February called Loserville: How Professional Sports Remade Atlanta and How Atlanta Remade Professional Sports. My story actually begins in Baltimore. In 1953, Thomas D'Alessandro, the mayor, pushes very ardently to try to lure big league baseball to town, with the St. Louis Browns coming into the city, becoming the Orioles. D'Alessandro is one of the first major political leaders that I could find that pushed for a municipal investment in a stadium as a way of luring a team. They build a second deck on what was Municipal Stadium, which gets renamed Memorial Stadium after the war. And there's a significant municipal investment in luring this team to town. Essentially, my story is an offshoot of that one. It is the story of Atlanta's pursuit of pro sports in the 1960s, the arrival of these teams. Very quickly, Atlanta gets 4 teams: a big league baseball team with the Braves, an NFL team with the Falcons, an NBA team with the Hawks, and an NHL team, the first one in the South, with the Flames in a 6-year period. And the public response to these teams over their first decade in town, which was largely lukewarm. I actually wrote a piece for the University of Nebraska blog this morning about the Braves championships, and I point out that Ted Turner merits some of the congratulations for what happened last night, because Big League Baseball almost certainly was going to leave town in the mid 70s. It may have reappeared at another time, but the Braves were headed for possibly New Orleans, possibly Toronto, when he buys the team in 1976. So this is the story of Atlanta's grand aspirations to become a big league city, and then the lukewarm response its teams got over its first decade in the big leagues. It's a story of a city and its teams in the 60s and 70s. And Atlanta, building on what cities like Baltimore started to do in the 50s, Atlanta had a very concerted corporate um, campaign to try to lure big league sports to town. They had a mayor who got elected in 1961 named Ivan Allen, who had a platform called Major League City. He explicitly wanted to take Atlanta from being this important regional economic hub to being a city that appeared in the standings alongside New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, that it had the credibility of the big leagues, which showed it was a major city in its own right. He wanted Atlanta to have the cultural prestige which pro sports increasingly took on in the second half of the 20th century. And to do so, Atlanta rolled out the red carpet. They hyped themselves to the nation, just as Atlanta had done for many decades previously, as a way of luring factories from other parts of the country, branch plants from corporations. Atlanta also finances two stadiums, Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, which becomes the home of the Braves and the Falcons, as well as the Omni Coliseum, which becomes the home of the Hawks and the Flames. And Atlanta very quickly, because of its willingness to both hype itself and also to invest in pro sports, gets teams very quickly in a newly expanding national sports marketplace. Because of highways, because of jet travel, having teams across the continent becomes more reasonable for the major pro sports leagues, which had historically been based in the Northeast and the Midwest. Also, there are more cities with enough people with disposable income to support pro sports, particularly in the nation's Sun Belt. Atlanta is really the first of these cities to, in a concerted way, pursue pro sports. Certainly, you'd had the relocation of the Giants and the Dodgers to California before, but those were more one-off anomalies as opposed to a concerted civic plan to become major league. Atlanta wasn't so much interested in having prestigious stadiums or just having a particular team as an attraction in town. They saw merely having major league teams, this, and by they I mean the political and corporate leadership, as proof that the city had national prestige, and they saw it also as a way to bind the community together. Atlanta certainly had existing racial divides. It had divides based on urban versus suburban conflict. It had large numbers of transplants from other parts of the country who were little connected to the actual city of Atlanta, particularly those who settled in the suburbs. So the city leaders by the mid 1960s were looking for what they called a center of gravity, and they saw Atlanta Stadium and later the Omni Coliseum as being that. How did this turn out? Not exactly as expected. Atlanta's teams, generally speaking, struggled both in the standings and at the box office for much of the 1960s and 1970s. The Braves came to town being perceived as a potential contender for the NL pennant. They struggled for several years when they got to town, had the aberration of the 1969 divisional title, but then to continue to struggle throughout much of the 70s and 80s. And their performance in terms of the box office certainly corresponded to that. They were one of the worst drawing teams in baseball. The Falcons came into a very football mad market in Atlanta, but people's enthusiasms in the long term proved to be more for college football and Friday night high school football. Pro football was essentially the third day of football on the Atlanta calendar in this time period, and also the third most important. The Falcons drew well in their early years, but like most pro football teams, they relied on season tickets as the primary way to generate ticket sales, as opposed to baseball with a very long season. People tend to buy individual tickets. In football, most of the franchises rely primarily on season ticket holders. So the Falcons were able to sell large numbers of fairly inexpensive season tickets well into the 1970s. But the Falcons had a problem with what came to be called no-shows. That by 1974, more than a third of the tickets purchased to Falcons games didn't bother to get used. In two of their home dates in 1974, more than 40,000 tickets went unused. It was a little chilly those days, but it had more to do with people being simply just not interested in going out and watching a losing team. The Hawks came to Atlanta and were an immediately successful team. They had been very successful in St. Louis and continued that up, but there was very little interest in basketball in the region. Part of this was because the sport had not been historically all that popular in Georgia. The other issue is simply this is a city in the South coming right out of the Jim Crow era, and the Hawks had an almost exclusively black roster, and the residents of the region at the time did not embrace the team. The team's ownership thought that bringing in a white superstar, which they did in the case of Pete Maravich, would increase attendance. Temporarily, it did as a novelty, but the Hawks continued to draw poorly throughout much of the 1970s. The Hawks at the brand new Omni, with Pete Maravich, arguably the best known basketball player in the country, playing for their team, were oftentimes outdrawn by the professional wrestling matches held the same night at the City Armory, about 2 miles away. This is a building that was built during the Cleveland administration, which would have 5,000 standing room only fans every Friday night cheering on the good guys, wanting to fight the bad guys. A mile down the road, you have the Omni Coliseum with 2,500, 3,000 people sitting in plush theater seats watching Pete Maravich play basketball. They couldn't draw a crowd. One of the fundamental problems Atlanta sports found was that many people continued to support their local sporting passions, whether it was college football, whether it was pro wrestling, whether it was golf, whether it was boating, whether it was stock car racing. Things that had been popular in the region before the big leagues got there continued to be very popular. So the teams had to compete with that. They also had to compete with this huge transplant population, many of whom remained fans of the teams of New York or Chicago or wherever they were from, but didn't necessarily embrace Atlanta's franchises. In some ways, the outlier among Atlanta's four big league teams in the 60s and 70s, in terms of both performance and also attendance, was the Atlanta Flames. The Flames played a sport that nobody in Georgia had basically ever seen. There were no ice rinks, no ice rinks in Georgia at the time when the Flames arrived in town, let alone an ice rink even just to skate around on the weekend. There were literally no ice rinks in the state of Georgia when they arrived. The Flames immediately draw very well. They market themselves well to upscale suburban consumers, and it becomes a very popular night out in Atlanta in the 70s to come sit in this new arena, to come downtown, to dress up in furs and suits, to come see professional hockey. And the Flames are a competitive team immediately. They have a general manager named Cliff Fletcher, who had been the Canadiens general manager, who went out and got talented young players, knowing that trying to get name attractions had no appeal in Atlanta because Atlanta fans wouldn't have known who they were anyway. So he builds the team from the ground up into a very successful franchise, which makes the postseason in 6 of their 8 years in town. The Flames end up relocating from Atlanta less because of the team's support and more because their owner, Tom Cousins, who was a real estate mogul in Atlanta, got into trouble with some of his overbuilding in downtown Atlanta, selling off the Flames to Calgary, Alberta for about $20 million, which was more than 2.5 times what he paid initially for the team in 1972, proved to be a great way out of some of his financial perils. So the Flames leave as a result of that. The Braves threatened to leave. The Hawks threatened to leave. They stay in town essentially because of Ted Turner purchasing both franchises in the mid 1970s. The owners of the Braves had been absentee owners based in Chicago for most of their history in town. So finally, with Turner, they had a local owner, even though he wasn't at the time quite as well heeled as many of the other owners in baseball. And he buys the Hawks from Cousins, who had used the Hawks and the Flames as the twin attractions at his new arena. Cousins had been less interested in sports than he had been in building an arena and having events to promote there. And this, in terms of the sports business, which in many ways is a very specific and particular one, proved not to be the best way to do it. In the case of the Falcons had a local insurance magnate named Rankin Smith, who owned the team, who was very good at selling insurance, who didn't have a lot of expertise in pro football. And it certainly showed. He oftentimes relied on people in his insurance business to play prominent football roles. One of his vice presidents, Frank Wall, was the first general manager of the Atlanta Falcons, and his 1967 NFL draft class included 0 players who actually made the team. And this was on an expansion roster that was already weakened, not only by having to rely on an expansion draft from the other NFL team spitbacks, but also because you had the competing AFL at the time sapping away talent. So it was a pretty rough draft on the Falcons' part, and they were set back and were in rough shape for many, many years, not making the NFL postseason until 1978. In terms of the national impact of the story, in many ways, the willingness of Atlanta and the many cities that emulated it, such as San Diego or Tampa or Phoenix or Houston, uh, also pushing for their path to the big leagues, put cities like Baltimore, other more established pro sports cities, in a difficult position because then they had to fork over a lot of money to build stadiums, improve venues as a way of keeping their teams, because suddenly there were all these new competitor cities that were willing to pay the price to become big league. So in the case of Baltimore, you certainly see the relocation of the Colts and that team being under Robert Irsay, looking around trying to move the team to several different locations before landing in Indianapolis. You have the Bullets relocating relatively locally to the Cap Center. And in the case of Baltimore, you also have Baltimore seeking out poaching teams from other cities, which happens in the case of the Ravens. Cities like Baltimore get put in a very bad situation because all of a sudden there are far more markets which are willing to invest in pro sports than than there are franchises available because the leagues have monopolies. So cities have to make investments if they wish to remain major leagues. It's quite a trade-off in many ways. And essentially, my book is an origin story for how that world came into being. Cities like Atlanta pursued pro sports, got teams. It didn't necessarily work out as they intended. The response was lukewarm from the local public in Atlanta in its early years, as it was in San Diego, as it was in Tampa, as it was for some of the teams in Houston. So in many ways, Atlanta is the starting point for a restructuring of the national sporting landscape. And I'd love to answer any questions you have or go into particulars about the Braves or the other franchises or speak to any issues related to this. But I just wanted to give you a broad overview of my book and answer any questions you have.
I guess one question I might have is how did you, I guess I have an idea, but how did you come up with the name of Loserville?
In July 1975, Louis Grizzard, who was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, ran a two-part front-page series called Loserville, USA, which was essentially an indictment of Atlanta pro sports over their first decade in town. That all the sports writers in town had been the biggest boosters imaginable of all the teams, but suddenly they were very apathetic to them, keeping distance from the teams. And he was essentially trying to capture the mood of sports in the city at the time. That it wasn't the cool thing anymore for people in the sports media to present themselves as being boosters of the team, as the citizens in these communities had not done so either. So the title comes from that. It's not really, certainly considering last night, it's not an attempt to make a comment on Atlanta today. It's a comment on this particular period in Atlanta sports. Because if you look at it, the Braves have certainly since roughly 1990, when John Schuerholz takes over in the front office, been one of the model organizations in baseball. The Falcons played very well for 3 quarters in a Super Bowl. The Hawks have been in recent years fairly competitive, and they certainly had that period in the 1980s with Dominic Wilkins and Spud Webb and Mike Fratello when they were a very interesting team that drew quite well both locally and as a road attraction too. So this is more a commentary on this particular moment in the city's history.
Mm-hmm. I can personally recall how they Braves took off in the for one, they really rose in 1982 because I'm in North Carolina. And so I'm several hours from Atlanta, but I bought tickets to a Braves game prior to the 1982 season. It was actually a weekend series because I saw where they were going to honor the old Milwaukee Braves. And I bought tickets thinking the Braves were in for another bad season. And I bought them in early April.
Oh, wow.
For August weekend. And by August, they were in the pennant race. And, the town was crazy over them at that time. That was the year that Chris Chambliss, Dale Murphy, and all these guys had, Bob Horner had great years. But that was quite a rise from what they had been previously.
Absolutely, and it was a great juxtaposition with what happened having this national television audience through TBS and also being an attractive team too. They take on the America's Team moniker during that time period. And for a moment, the Braves are a great national draw as a result of that. Things over the course of the late 80s get a little rough in the kind of Chuck Tanner era. Yeah, the Braves certainly showed their potential at that moment to be an excellent draw both at home and also to have a national audience. To have them, I mean, there was a Sports Illustrated cover in 1982 about the phenomenon of the Braves on cable TV, of them being the most popular team in Fargo, North Dakota, and Juneau, Alaska, and Gallup, New Mexico, and all these different places. So yeah, I mean, Turner opened many opportunities for this team to be seen in different places. Even from day one, though, when the Braves were on WSB out of Atlanta, they had a fairly large regional presence. I mean, one of the reasons the Milwaukee Braves wanted to move in the first place was that you had a 7-state region where there were no big league sports at the time. So they had this particular market all to themselves, which was growing rapidly in this time period. So the grand aspirations of the ownership are certainly shaped by this media market as well.
Mhm.
Hey, Clayton, question for you in the chat.
How do I see the long-term attendance pressures of the Braves as much as the higher? I think the Braves have to win to continue to draw well. I think in terms of their fan base, moving to Cobb County was reflective of where their fans were. When they first announced this, they published a map of where the season ticket holders were for the Braves, and they tended to be in affluent northern suburbs like the ones in Cobb County, where they've moved their stadium. But I think Atlanta has so many cultural offerings, has a very highly suburbanized fan base. These fans are going to support primary. These are very, I guess you would call them discerning consumers, I would say, in metropolitan Atlanta, as they've been since the 1960s. The suburbs are, I mean, in many ways shaped historically by consumerism. And if you don't have this long-term tie to the team, unless the team is winning, the sense of devotion or affection to the team is not like this long-held family tradition. So I think the Braves have to continue to win. I mean, college football is certainly king in the region to this day. I mean, for all of the SEC schools, Atlanta remains the hub of the hub of where those people end up going for work, for building their future lives. So I think competing with college football is going to be an issue going forward for all of Atlanta's franchises, not only the Braves. I hope that answers the question. Also, anytime I've been to a Braves game, there've always been a lot of hats of the other team at the games, and the people I spoke with back in the 60s who went to the 1969 NLCS talked about it being half Met fans at the game in the National League Championship Series. Actually, when the Braves played the Mets in the NLCS in Atlanta in game 1 and 2, those games were outdrawn as an event locally by 3 other sporting events. The University of Georgia was at home, Georgia Tech was at home, and the biggest drawing event of the weekend was the Falcons for the first time were hosting the Baltimore Colts. And they set up extra seats and extra bleachers for people who wanted to come see Johnny U and the Colts play. So that tells you where the sporting attitudes of the Atlanta public were. That the NLCS were the 4th and 5th best drawing sporting events of the weekend. The first time they had a baseball playoff there.
Do you believe that the teams that are there now, that is the Braves, the Falcons, and the Hawks, are secure there?
Yes, yeah, I do. I think they have much better ownership than they did initially. I think they all have very corporatized ownership, which in many ways is run in a similar fashion to the other major pro sports franchises. I think in particular Arthur Blank with the Falcons has a very well-run professional organization. It's very much the opposite of what the Falcons were like under Rankin Smith's family. Locally, they were known as the Clampetts because they were these kind of seen as these wealthy, genial kind of rubes kind of things, the way they were presented as being. Everybody liked them, but they were not hardcore football aficionados, and they didn't build a team around that. So it seems like I would say the ownership groups are pretty strong that are in place now.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on the chop? It's going to disappear. It's a matter of time. Yeah, I won't. I mean, in terms of the team's moniker, I'm not sure about that, but I think the chop is eventually on the way out. This championship may give it a new life. I don't know, but I perceive it as being on the way out. I see that.
Will the push for that come from Atlanta itself or from HQ MLB?
I think it'll come from a lot of different factors. I think if you look at Atlanta in the 1960s, you see the reason Atlanta got pro sports in the first place was that it was by far the most progressive city in the South. They're the only major city in the South that really desegregated on its own before the Civil Rights Acts. And Mayor Allen in Atlanta very courageously goes and testifies on behalf of them, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I guess my point here is that when you decide you want to go from being a regional center to part of the national sports conversation, you're part of the broader national conversation in a more general sense. And I think anything Atlanta does can't be just in a little local regional box perceived in those terms. It has to be part of a national story. And I think over time the pressure for in regards to the shop, whether it's from HQ, whether it's from the broader culture as a whole, or whether it comes from Atlanta itself, I think it will disappear in the relatively near future.
But how are they actually going to make the fans stop doing it?
I don't think they have to. I don't think they have to. I think it will stop for. I mean, things. I think in many ways, efforts to restrict things tend to be downstream of cultural changes. So I think it will reflect cultural changes more than it will. An effort to legislate it. I think we're also at a particularly contentious cultural moment as everybody knows, over the past few years. I can see it kind of fading away in a less contentious cultural moment, which hopefully is over the horizon.
I saw, some of you may have seen it. I think it was referred to in one of the This Week's in SABR, when they have all these web articles that they list that have to do with baseball. Very interesting article that he said that there's a moment in time here that the Braves could make the change, because they could just change the name to the Atlanta Hammers in honor of Hank Aaron. And, that would change the nickname, and it'd probably be, by some people at least, accepted.
That's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about that.
Hammer. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. That's an interesting thought.
I don't know if it would go over widely, but at least it would be something people might entertain.
Yeah, absolutely.
Question, Clayton. Why
Yes.
did they leave Turner Field? Because of its location? Because I was only there once. As you know, another Baltimore connection, when they built for the Olympics, and they still had Fulton County, and they built what is now Turner Field, and then chopped it up, a good use of the word chop, and created a baseball-only park, which I think Janet Marie Smith was involved with. So they only played there from 97 to 2016.
2016, yeah.
I finally went there the last year and saw it in its final season. And of course, they had a lot of playoff runs and World Series and whatnot. So did they leave because of the neighborhood that it's in? And
that's certainly part of it. I mean, that's been an issue from day one, really. I mean, if you look at the history of the stadium, Atlanta Fulton County Stadium was on urban renewal land, neighborhood there previously, that got destroyed in the late 50s as part of urban renewal slum clearance. The city promised they were going to build affordable housing there, but the first time anybody showed any interest, the city leaders go and buy that land from the local housing authority and turn it into what becomes Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, mostly because you have 32 lanes of interstate highway converging on this. It was surrounded by some of the most impoverished neighborhoods and some of the roughest neighborhoods in the city, Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. There was never a lot of infrastructure stuff to do right around the stadium. In terms of getting MARTA to the stadium, you were like a mile walk away from it. So it was Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, and then its successor, Turner Field, suffered from that in a broader sense. There's certainly the racial issue of suburbanites being uncomfortable coming into a predominantly African American neighborhood. There is certainly the issue of suburbanites commuting into the city. There's certainly the issue of, to be frank, it's a neighborhood that's had significant crime problems throughout its history. I mean, you have a Jesse Outlar, who was the sports editor of the Atlanta Constitution, got shot in the stomach in a robbery in 1973, right after a game. He had filed his story and nearly died. And there were incidents, many different incidents that happened in and around the stadium. So I would say a discomfort and really exaggerated fears built around that discomfort ended up playing a role in the reshaping of where the Braves are now. Also, part of it is simply a matter of the price being right, that you have this essentially secret taxing entity in Cobb County that didn't require voter approval. It was a self-taxing unit of businesses essentially that paid for the stadium. That they came in and said, hey, you don't have to be in Atlanta anymore. You can be out here in Cobb County. We're building a new stadium. We're building infrastructure with the battery and everything around it. So it's a mix of the standing discomforts with this new opportunity out in the burbs where a lot of their fan base was. So it's a mix of those different things. And I go into that in great detail in the book.
So are they, aside from the Angels, who can't even pick their right name these days, are they the only team that doesn't play in the jurisdiction of their name?
Well, I mean, in big league baseball, I don't know. I mean, in NFL, you certainly have the New York Jets and New York Giants.
Right.
I mean,
I'm thinking of MLB because I kind of don't follow other ones, but obviously they still play in Anaheim and use LA. But yeah, when they moved out of Atlanta, I was like, oh, that's interesting. Even though considering, remember the baseball movie only about 8 or 9 years ago that was centered around a Brave Scout.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't even thought about that aspect of it. That's a great point.
I think it's not only, as someone who has been down there to Atlanta for games in the past, a few games, not a lot, but because I'm still 5 hours from Atlanta, but where I live in North Carolina, not only the fact that they moved to the suburbs, and I know the inner city issues are real and they're of concern, but not only the fact that the Braves moved out to the suburbs, but they moved to Cobb County, which, if I'm correct, I know I'm correct on this, puts them closer to the South Carolina traffic from Spartanburg and Greenville, in an area of South Carolina that is rather well-to-do. And
Yes.
it makes it easier for people to come 100 miles or 80 miles in from that affluent area of South Carolina into, and they don't have to go into the city of Atlanta at all with the traffic. They
Yes,
get to the stadium before they get to it.
Yes, that's certainly the case. I don't know the degree to which that influenced the decision they made, but yeah, I mean it's certainly much easier. And roadways have played as prominent a role with the Braves as any franchise. I mean, the spot of the stadium for Atlanta Fulton County Stadium was selected by Charlie Finley. Charlie Finley went to town in 1963, of course, angry with what was going on in Kansas City. Within 2 minutes of buying that club, he was fighting with the local leadership. And he becomes friends with Furman Bisher, who's the editor of the Atlanta Journal, the sports editor of the Atlanta Journal. They're both prominent in Easter seals. And Bisher shows him around town, and he picks out this empty piece of land among all these interstates. It was this urban renewal site, which was going to be affordable housing. And he says, build your stadium here, and I will move my team to town. And Atlanta gets to work. The problem is Charlie Finley doesn't get along with the other American League owners, and they don't want to reward him for his behavior, so they refuse to grant him this opportunity. So that's why Atlanta goes looking for another team to move to their new stadium.
In the world of speculation and MLB expansion, one team that is constantly mentioned is Charlotte. Was there any need for Atlanta to move quickly to be in the northern part or north of their previous stadium, hoping to lock in prospective fans before a Charlotte franchise is formed?
I don't know, but that's a great point, certainly. And certainly you have Nashville also pushing for it too. So you have a lot of potential fan bases in both of those locations who, yeah, I mean, where Cobb County would be more amenable. So that's a great point. I hadn't thought about that, but I think it's certainly possible.
Of course, I think the overriding, I mean, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I think the overriding factor from what I've read is the financial inducements they got from Cobb County.
Yes.
That was the primary thing, I believe.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, certainly the price was right. I mean, they were going to build them a stadium, and the city of Atlanta basically says you have a perfectly good stadium. The city's leadership in town, I think, was very pragmatic about it. They didn't just say, "Oh, we'll give in and build you a new stadium 20 years later." They essentially called Atlanta's bluff, and Atlanta, I mean, or the Braves' bluff, and the Braves chose to move. The same thing happened with the Thrashers, basically, too. And the guy who was the mayor at the time was a guy named Kasim Reed, who basically said, my constituency in the city of Atlanta is not the ones who are going to the Thrashers games. If somebody in suburban Atlanta wants to build them a stadium, great. We're not going to build them a new arena to keep them in town. So off they go to Winnipeg, Manitoba. So I think also Atlanta early on in its relationship with pro sports leagues kind of was willing to do whatever they wanted to. The league, do whatever, we'll do whatever you need to get a team, whether it was for the Falcons, whether it was for the Braves or the other franchises. They were willing to do what it takes to get these teams. The leagues could essentially call the shots. That's not the case with Atlanta anymore, who's a lot more nuanced in the way they've dealt with these recent stadium situations. Even if you look at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, which is this billion-dollar juggernaut, Arthur Blank, the owner of the Falcons, ends up paying for a clear majority of this. This certainly wouldn't have been the case in an earlier generation. The city also worked out $30 million in repayments to people whose homes, a number of churches, other institutions had to be relocated as a result of stadium construction. The city did a good job getting that money in to support people who were negatively impacted by it too. So I think the city is a much better negotiator than it was 2 generations earlier in this regard.
Guys have any other questions for Clayton? Comments? Do you think Freddie Freeman's staying?
I'll make one comment. You certainly come across really, you got a lot in your head because you haven't been looking at notes or anything.
Kind of you to say. Thank you. Just running my mouth is a family tradition. So
You think Freddie Freeman's going to stay?
Well, Joe Buck doesn't think so, apparently. I don't know. I sure hope he does. I think he could become the next Dale Murphy, Chipper Jones in town if he chooses to do so. Atlanta, in spite of its many times lukewarm support for teams, the fans really embrace a guy who embraces the town. And I was on another podcast a while back speaking on behalf of Dale Murphy as a Hall of Famer. And part of the reason I said is if the Hall of Fame always talks about the morality clause and stuff. You couldn't find a more upstanding citizen than Dale Murphy. I mean, a better, role model and representative for kids. I also argue he's the first cable television baseball star because the coverage got so built around him. You watch a Braves game during the 80s, he could be 5 batters away from coming up. It's a next inning, Dale Murphy may bat. It wasn't even like he was in the hole or something. Well, if Ozzie Virgil gets a hit and, Rafael Belliard walks, then maybe, Dale Murphy will come up to bat. But yeah, they built their entire coverage around it, and he was a genuine national baseball star in the 80s.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, had to go play for the terrible Phillies.
Indeed. He had a rough end to his career, but unlike some players who came a few years later, in his mid-30s, he actually got a little worse, unlike some guys who got a little better in their mid-30s.
Well, that was before the magic potions of the day.
Yes.
I don't know whether it means a thing, but I know here in North Carolina, we've got a couple of prominent radio personalities in sports who have been saying today that the Braves know they got to sign Freddie Freeman again. That
yes,
it would, that he can, that they'll meet his price because they know it'd be a public relations disaster if they didn't.
It certainly would. One wonders if his agent got in Joe Buck's ear last night when he's making intoning about that over the last two at bats of the game.
How do you see the 2022 season for the Braves? Some of the pluses and some of the minuses that would carry over from this season.
It was a funny season because if you followed the Braves through like mid-August, this team won, they lost, they were 500 all the way. I leave a lot of credit to their coaching staff for just shepherding this team, just getting into the postseason, finding a way to make it happen, be clutch in many situations throughout. I think there's many questions about the depth of this lineup moving forward, and I also question how strong their bullpen is. I mean, the back end's very strong, but from top to bottom, I don't know if this is a bullpen that's going to be able to go out and win 95, 100 games, depending on what is needed in the division. I think the idea that you're going to get in with 88 wins, that's that's really chancing things. You're not always going to be the 87 Twins, because when I looked at this team all along, I thought, okay, there's all these other teams that won like 100 games. They barely sneak into the playoffs and they keep finding a way to make it happen. So, if you told me the Braves are going to go 79 and 83 next year, I totally believe it. I think part of it has to do with their offseason acquisitions. And I think also defending a championship is an incredibly difficult thing to do. I mean, there's a tremendous that you're going out there presenting yourself to the world. You're not going to be as focused. How hungry are you going to be? So if you told me the Braves return to the postseason, I'd believe it. If you told me that they're going to have a really rough season and be on the back end of the NL East, I'd believe that as well.
Yes, the acquisitions that they had on the offensive line, Solar and Duvall and Rosario and Jock Peterson. I think, that hand was played well, maybe 4 aces or 4 jacks. But especially Rosario, I would think that it would be extremely difficult to top that next year or even come close. So
Yes,
those 4 pieces played a critical role in their championship. And I'm just wondering what they would look like next year.
Yeah, there's such a funny thing. They're so inverse of the 2020 team, which had a great start. It'll be interesting to see how they come out of the gate and how they end up presenting themselves as a team. I really don't know what to expect. I think it's very difficult to know out of a defending champion what you're going to see the next season.
I think too that they could have a surplus of outfielders, and some of them will probably be moved because when Ron Acuna comes back from his injury, they'll have another one out there, and that would be all these 4 that Thomas mentioned. But one thing I heard today, I hadn't really thought about it, but with the exception of Freddie Freeman, who's like 33 years old or so, it's at second base with Albies, shortstop with Swanson, third base with Riley. They're all relatively young players who'll be around for years, and they played, according to what I heard on the radio today, 155 games each, at least 155 games of the regular season each. In other words, they were the infield. Wow. Freeman and those other 3. So they are well set in the infield if there are no injuries, which of course is a big if for any team.
Yes, who knows? They could be in the midst of another run like they had in the 90s of just being there every year. It's tough to know. I mean, one thing Hank Aaron talked about in the 70s playing in Atlanta is just standing out there in the outfield for several hours every day in the Georgia sun really saps a guy that by the 4th of July, he felt like he was ready to pack it in many years. I know there's things they can do now that they didn't have in, say, 1972, but just day in, day out being consistently effective in that atmosphere, I think, is a challenge in and of itself.
Do you have any comments on third base coach Ron Washington?
In what respect?
Longevity, redemption.
I think it's
a good instructor.
It's a fantastic redemption story. I think I'm not well enough informed to say how good of an instructor he is, but I think it's fantastic to see him back in baseball and so successful.
Hey, Clayton, how did you, being somebody from, sounds like you're from the Northeast.
Yes. I have
How
no
did you
connection
know-
with Atlanta whatsoever.
What's that?
I have no connection whatsoever. I had been there once before I started the project because my uncle got transferred down there for like a year, and we visited him one time. And I went to Atlanta Fulton County Stadium with 200 other people that night, or whatever, however many people were in attendance. But yeah, are you asking how I got picked?
How you picked Atlanta, obviously.
When I was in graduate school, I was looking for a topic for my dissertation. I'm a U.S. urban historian. I wanted initially to write about the impact of franchise relocations on cities. My advisor said this will take you 70 years. You have to pick a particular city to focus on, which is emblematic of the story you wish to tell. So I looked around. I thought about doing a city like Cleveland, maybe, or St. Louis, that had tended to be the I guess on the losing end of state and franchise relocations. I ended up deciding to pick a Sunbelt city because I felt like their stories had been told a little bit less. And I picked Atlanta because I saw they're kind of at the starting point of this for many of the cities in the South that end up getting pro sports. So I was between them and Phoenix, and I'm not even sure why I ended up picking Atlanta. I think I picked them primarily because they were really out of the gate in the region in terms of this. So I had no connection to Atlanta whatsoever. I've spent a lot of time in Atlanta and a lot of time thinking about Atlanta ever since then, and made many friends there as a result of it. But yeah, I have no connection to the region whatsoever. And in the couple of reviews of the book that exist so far, they always make a point. Vermont-based academic has opinions about Georgia, and there's always a little bit of suspicion about what I'm saying because of that. But that's fine, and I welcome that, and I've made a point of trying to do the best I can to understand the time and place I'm writing about, even though I have no connection to it whatsoever.
Yes, when I first saw advertising, I saw the title Loserville and had to do with sports. First, I shouldn't say this because my wife might hear it, but I thought of Philadelphia. But just because of the history of the Phillies and some of their other relatively atrocious franchises. So, but I'm looking forward to reading it.
Oh, I've heard Cleveland people have said it's about Cleveland. San Diego people have told me about San Diego. Many people have tried to claim this Loserville mantle.
When's it coming out? February, you said?
Comes out February 1st. It's available for pre-order now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all your fine online retailers. I'm on Twitter at Clayton Trutor. I'm on Facebook, and I'd love to be your friend too. And I'm just on there talking about Atlanta sports and sports more generally pretty often.
For those of you who've been to conventions in the past, obviously there hasn't been one since 2019. University of Nebraska usually has a table in the vendor room. So hopefully that'll be one of the featured books for purchase next August.
Oh, fantastic! I hope so, and I'll certainly be there, and I can hang out at the table and hector people into getting the book. But we'll see. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I've always found the history of Baltimore sports to be so interesting. So it's been an honor to speak with your group.
Oh, we appreciate it. We're interestingly, those of you, but obviously people here SABR members longer than I've been. But our chapter's only existed for a little over 6 years, and we're already getting a national convention and a lot of pretty good press. So we're very excited, obviously, to host SABR 50 finally next summer, and show off Baltimore, because we're kind of the city people forget about in between DC and Philadelphia. So and with the most people don't realize next April will be 30 years since Camden Yards opened. So that'll probably be a topic and panel.
It still feels like a new ballpark to me when I say, the new ballparks like Camden Yards. So it's, I mean, it's totally how it's, and I bet I'm not alone in that. I think a lot of people think of it as the first of the new ballparks in terms of perceiving it.
I think they're like the fourth oldest now.
It's crazy. And Skydome is being the newest of the old stadiums because it's such a they're building the Death Star up there in like 1989 or whatever. It's a very odd stadium to have come in right before all these great new places like Camden Yards. I sent the link. That's the book's website, and I'm actually going to, if it's okay, if it's not too overzealous, a couple articles I've written that might be of interest to your chapter. This is a piece I wrote about the Baltimore Bullets' 50th anniversary of getting to the NBA Finals, and I did a piece for I did a piece on the best baseball players from the Eastern Shore, which might be of somewhat regional interest as well. Let me find that too.
Hey Clayton, while you're looking at this is Aaron Hill. I'm actually with the Atlanta chapter, and I just when I saw the title of the book, I jumped in on kind of I guess bombed in from that. But you should reach out to Craig Brown, our contact here, to maybe do something for the Magnolia chapter in Atlanta.
Oh, I'd love to. Love to. Do you have can you put his email address in the chat, and then
I
I'll
can.
plug him. Thank you so much.
I will. Yeah, I will, because I just I saw that title and I was like, well, I gotta hear being long time Atlanta sports fan.
A few years back, I talked with a few guys I interviewed probably 3 or 4 guys from the Atlanta chapter back in like 2015 for the book. I don't know if they're still associated or not. I'm trying to think of the names, but yeah, I interviewed.
I just joined about a year and a half ago, but there's several long-term members. In fact, I think the last original founding member of SABR's actually started as part of our chapter. If you talk to Tom Huffman, maybe, I mean, he's literally, I read interviews and saw articles with him at for the 50th anniversary.
Oh wow,
Tom Hufford, yes.
Hufford, yes, correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm a member of the Magnolia chapter also, Aaron.
See, I thought when you said North Carolina, and I thought you looked familiar.
Oh, well, yeah, well, I'm a member of a whole bunch of chapters, but yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron. Oh, yeah, you're welcome. And you know what? I think we did a joint Carolinas call, a few months ago. Maybe that's where I saw you on there. Yeah. So, well, thanks again, Clayton. Really appreciate it. And
oh, this was so much fun. I love it. I love having the Zoom and being able to talk to chapters across the country. It's so much fun. There's like the Nashville chapter. I went and I talked to them, and I've come to like 2 of their other meetings just because I like the speakers and stuff. It's great having all these different opportunities to talk baseball with people.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, if there's no other questions, we all have lives, unfortunately, even though there's no more season. For you guys,
get that hot stove going.
True.
Less than a month left in the CBA.
Yeah, that's true. Aaron, I'll add you to our chapter roster so you can get some of the updates and stuff.
Sure. Yeah. I grew up in Virginia and went to the first game at Camden Yards, actually. So yeah, I'd be happy to be added there.
Okay, cool. Hopefully you can come to the convention next summer.
Planning on it. Yeah. So
I have no excuse. I live 8 blocks from the hotel where it's being hosted. So people are looking to me to help shoulder a little bit of the burden. But anyway, thank you guys. We have the next calls 2 weeks from today. Aaron, I'll forward you the email. And we have Jeff Arnold during the lunch call. I guess that's the 17th.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Wednesday the 17th.
Yeah, that's right.
So we'll have one of the broadcasters from the Orioles in Masson with us. And yeah, anybody needs anything, just give a holler. If not, hopefully see you then, or if not then, the next talk at the end of the month or early December. It's hard to believe 2021 is going to be done in less than 2 months, but we're getting there. So
thanks again. Bye-bye.
All right, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Be in touch. Have a good weekend, everybody.
You too.